October 14th, 1943, 27,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany. 11:42 a.m. The air at this altitude was thin enough to starve unprotected lungs, cold enough to freeze moisture into crystals that hung suspended in the bomber's slipstream. Staff Sergeant Benjamin Watkins sat behind his Browning M2 50 caliber machine gun in the waist position of a B-17 Flying Fortress. His oxygen mask fogging with each breath, his electrically heated suit barely keeping hypothermia at bay. Through the plexiglass window, he could see the contrails of 300 American bombers stretching across the sky like chalk lines drawn by a trembling hand. Then he saw them coming. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Vid-190s, diving from above and ahead, their wings sparkling with cannon fire. The German fighters came in formations of 3 and 4, exploiting the blind spots in the bomber formations, targeting stragglers and damaged aircraft. Watkins swung his gun toward an approaching FW-190, leading the target the way he had been taught in gunnery school, ahead of the fighter's nose, accounting for closure speed and bullet drop. His thumbs pressed the butterfly trigger. The gun came alive. The sound was not a single explosion, but a continuous metallic roar, a percussive thunder that vibrated through the aircraft's frame and into Watkins' chest. The recoil was tremendous, despite the mounting, but the gun's mechanism absorbed it, cycling 850 rounds per minute through the feed system. Brass shell casings ejected in a golden stream, tumbling through the air and clattering against the fuselage walls. Smoke poured from the barrel. The smell of burning powder filled the cramped gun position, despite the slipstream tearing through the open waist window. The tracers, every fifth round loaded with phosphorus, that ignited and glowed, drew a visible line from Watkins' gun to the FW-190. He watched the stream of fire walk across the fighter's wing. Root, the 50 caliber rounds, each weighing nearly 2 ounces and traveling at 2,900 feet per second, struck with kinetic energy exceeding 13,000 foot-pounds. They did not merely puncture the German fighter, they tore through it. Pieces of aluminum skin peeled away. The canopy shattered. Something critical in the engine or fuel system failed catastrophically because the FW-190 suddenly pitched downward, trailing black smoke and flame. Watkins did not watch it fall. There were more fighters coming. He traversed the gun toward another target, pressed the trigger again, felt the weapon's violent rhythm synchronize with his heartbeat. The gun fired until the belt ran dry. Then he grabbed another ammunition can and reloaded with hands that had performed this action so many times it had become muscle memory executed through thick gloves in sub-zero temperatures. This was the reality of air combat over Germany in 1943, not the sanitized version shown in newsreels or described in press releases, but the raw arithmetic of metal striking metal at closing speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. The Browning 50 caliber machine gun had become the primary defensive weapon of American heavy bombers, and it was proving devastatingly effective against Luftwaffe fighters in ways that German pilots had not anticipated and could not adequately counter the sound of the 50 caliber, that distinctive hammering roar multiplied by 10 or 12 guns firing simultaneously from a single bomber, multiplied again by hundreds of bombers in formation, became the acoustic signature of American air power over Europe. It was the sound that Luftwaffe pilots learned to fear, the sound that represented American industrial capacity translated into 850 armor-piercing incendiary rounds per minute per gun, the sound that meant a fighter attack was entering a cone of fire so dense that evasion became as important as attack. The evolution of aerial gunnery, understanding why the 50 caliber Browning M2 dominated aerial combat, requires understanding where aerial gunnery began and how it evolved through 2 decades of increasingly lethal innovation. In World War I, Early fighters were armed with rifle-caliber machine guns, typically 30-caliber weapons, firing rounds designed for infantry use. These guns were adequate against the wooden fabric aircraft of 1917, but they were marginal weapons. Pilots often expended hundreds of rounds to achieve a single kill. Ammunition capacity was limited. Reliability was poor. By the 1930s, aircraft had evolved. Fighters were faster, more maneuverable, and increasingly built with metal construction that resisted rifle-caliber rounds. The strategic bombing doctrine that emerged during this period envisioned large formations of bombers striking deep into enemy territory, protected by their own defensive armament, rather than fighter escorts, whose range limitations prevented them from accompanying bombers to distant targets. This doctrine required bomber defensive guns that could destroy attacking fighters before those fighters could press their attacks home. Rifle-caliber guns were inadequate. What was needed was a heavy machine gun that fired a projectile large enough to inflict catastrophic damage on fighters with a single well-placed burst, that fired fast enough to saturate the brief window when attacking fighters were in range, and that was reliable enough to function in the extreme conditions of high-altitude flight. John Moses Browning had designed the M2 50-caliber machine gun in 1918 for ground use. The weapon fired a cartridge, the 50 BMG Browning machine gun, that was substantially more powerful than any rifle-caliber round. The bullet weighed 660 grains, nearly 2 ounces, compared to the 150 grains of a typical 30-caliber bullet. The muzzle velocity was 2,900 feet per second. The kinetic energy was over 13,000 foot-pounds. This was not a rifle firing powerful rounds. This was a cannon firing somewhat smaller rounds at machine gun rates. The M2 was adopted by the U.S. military in the 1933 for ground use and was quickly recognized as potentially valuable for aircraft. But adapting a ground weapon for aerial use required substantial modification. The gun needed to be lighter while maintaining structural strength to handle recoil forces. It needed to function reliably in temperatures ranging from -60 degrees Fahrenheit at altitude to +120 degrees on the ground. It needed to cycle consistently despite the thin air at bomber operating altitudes. It needed to feed from belts or boxes that could supply hundreds of rounds without jamming. Between 1933 and 1940, American engineers refined the M2 for aircraft use. The resulting weapon, designated the AN-M2 for Army-Navy Model 2, weighed 64 pounds without ammunition compared to 84 pounds for the ground version. It had a rate of fire between 750 and 850 rounds per minute, depending on adjustment. It could fire sustained bursts limited only by ammunition supply and barrel heating. The weapon was reliable enough that properly maintained guns could fire tens of thousands of rounds between failures. Most critically, the ammunition was devastating against aircraft. The standard ammunition mix loaded every 5th round as a tracer for aiming, but the remaining rounds were armor-piercing incendiary API projectiles. These rounds had hardened steel cores that could penetrate armor plate up to half an inch thick at combat ranges. Behind the armor-piercing core was an incendiary charge, a small payload of chemicals that ignited on impact. When an API round penetrated an aircraft's fuel tank or oil system, the incendiary charge ignited the fuel or oil, starting fires that could destroy the aircraft within seconds. The Germans and Japanese, developing their own fighters during the same period, made different choices. The Luftwaffe armed most fighters with a combination of rifle-caliber machine guns and 20mm cannons. The cannons fired explosive shells that were devastating when they hit. But the rate of fire was much lower, around 500 rounds per minute, and ammunition capacity was limited to 60 to 90 rounds per gun. A Bf-109 typically carried 2 7.92mm machine guns and one 20mm cannon. Total sustained firepower was approximately 100 rounds per minute across all weapons, Lasting about 30 seconds before the cannon ammunition was exhausted, Japanese fighters made similar choices. The Mitsubishi A6M0 carried two 7.7mm machine guns and two 20mm cannons. The cannons had drum magazines holding only 60 rounds each, about 7 seconds of fire. After the cannons were empty, the Zero was reduced to rifle-caliber guns that were marginally effective against American bombers. The Axis approach emphasized hitting power per projectile. The Allied approach, particularly the American approach, emphasized volume of fire and sustained engagement capability. Both philosophies worked for their intended purposes, but when applied to the specific problem of bomber defense, where gunners needed to fire at high-speed targets during brief engagement, windows while simultaneously facing multiple attackers, the American philosophy proved decisively superior. The arithmetic of destruction by 1943, the American heavy bomber offensive against Germany had reached the scale where statistical analysis of combat effectiveness became possible. Intelligence officers compiled detailed records of bomber losses, fighter claims, ammunition expenditure, and gun reliability. The data revealed patterns that validated the .50 caliber's effectiveness and exposed Luftwaffe vulnerabilities. A typical B-17G Flying Fortress carried 13 .50 caliber machine guns, 2 in the nose, 2 in the dorsal turret, 2 in the ball turret, 2 in the waist positions, 2 in the tail, 1 in the radio compartment, and 2 in the chin turret beneath the nose. Each gun had between 300 and 500 rounds of ammunition depending on position. A fully loaded B-17G carried approximately 5,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition weighing over 650 pounds. When a German fighter attacked a B-17, it entered a defensive sphere where multiple guns could engage it simultaneously. A head-on attack exposed the fighter to fire from the chin turret, nose guns, dorsal turret, and potentially the waist guns, 6 to 8 guns, firing a combined 5,000 to 6,800 rounds per minute. The fighter pilot had perhaps 2 to 3 seconds in effective firing range before closure speed forced him to break off. During those 3 seconds, the B-17's forward guns could fire 250 to 340 rounds at the attacking fighter. The probability mathematics were brutal. Each .50 caliber round had a cross-sectional area of approximately 0.2 square inches. A 3-second burst created a cone of 250 to 340 projectiles spread across the space the fighter occupied. The fighter's cross-sectional area varied with angle, but averaged around 100 square feet for a head-on attack, accounting for gunner accuracy, dispersion, and target maneuver. Mathematical models suggested that 2 to 5% of rounds fired at an attacking fighter under ideal conditions would strike the target. This meant a typical head-on attack resulted in 5 to 15 hits on the attacking fighter. The API rounds would penetrate the fighter's relatively thin armor. German fighters prioritized speed and maneuverability over protection, and the incendiary charges would ignite fuel or hydraulics or damage critical systems. 5 to 15 hits from .50 caliber. API rounds were often sufficient to destroy a fighter or inflict damage that forced it to break off the attack. Luftwaffe pilots quickly learned that pressing attacks to close range against B-17 formations was extremely dangerous. Loss rates among attacking fighters reached 10 to 15% per mission during major engagements. Pilots began standing off at longer ranges where the .50 caliber fire was less accurate, but this reduced their own accuracy and gave bomber gunners more time to track and engage them. Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke, a Luftwaffe fighter ace who survived the war and wrote a memoir, described the experience of attacking American bomber formations. The fire from the fortresses is incredible. Every bomber has 10 or 12 heavy machine guns, and when you approach a formation, you are flying into a wall of tracers. You can see them coming. You know that for every tracer, there are 4 bullets you cannot see. The closure speed is so high, you have perhaps 2 seconds to aim and fire before you must break away or collide. In those 2 seconds, you are flying through a cone of fire that seems solid. You feel the impacts. You hear them striking your aircraft. Sometimes you make it through. Sometimes your wingman does not. The testimony was consistent across Luftwaffe pilot accounts. The 50 caliber created a defensive barrier that could not be safely penetrated. Attacking bombers required accepting losses that would attrite fighter strength faster than replacements could be trained. The Germans tried various tactical innovations, attacking from different angles, using heavy fighters with more armor, standing off and using rockets, but none fully solved the problem that American bombers were simply too well defended by weapons that fired too fast and hit too hard. The industrial dimension, the 50 caliber's dominance, was not purely technical. It was industrial. The weapon's effectiveness derived partly from its ballistic performance, but equally from the fact that American industry could produce the guns and ammunition in quantities that overwhelmed Axis production capacity. By 1943, American factories were producing approximately 8,000 50 caliber machine guns per month. This included ground versions, aircraft versions, and specialized variants for different applications. The production was distributed across multiple manufacturers: Colt, Winchester, Frigidaire, General Motors, and others, using standardized specifications that ensured interchangeable parts. A gun manufactured by Colt would accept parts from a gun manufactured by Winchester. This interchangeability simplified logistics and maintenance. Ammunition production was even more staggering. American factories produced over 2 billion rounds of 50 caliber ammunition during the war. This included API, tracer, armor-piercing, and standard ball ammunition in various mixing ratios. The production rate by 1944 exceeded 100 million rounds per month. American bombers and fighters could expend ammunition freely because there was always more ammunition. Gunners were trained to fire sustained bursts rather than short, aimed shots because the doctrine emphasized saturation of the target area. The Germans could not match this production. German industry produced approximately 40,000 aircraft-mounted machine guns of all types per year by 1943, roughly one-third the American production of 50 caliber guns alone. German ammunition production was similarly constrained. The 20mm cannon ammunition was complex to manufacture, requiring precision machining and explosive filling for each shell. Production rates were measured in millions rather than hundreds of millions. This disparity created a feedback loop. American gunners could fire freely, which increased hit probability through volume of fire. German pilots faced opponents who seemed to have unlimited ammunition and could maintain defensive fire throughout extended engagements. Japanese pilots faced similar conditions in the Pacific, where the 50 caliber was equally dominant. The industrial advantage extended beyond pure numbers to logistics and maintenance. American 50 caliber guns in bomber turrets could be removed and replaced in 30 minutes by trained armorers. Barrels could be changed in 10 minutes. Ammunition was standardized and available at every airbase in quantities sufficient to reload entire bomber groups. The logistics system ensured that guns were maintained, ammunition was available, and replacement parts were in stock. German logistics, by contrast, struggled constantly with shortages. Cannon ammunition was rationed. Replacement barrels were scarce. Parts compatibility varied between manufacturers. Luftwaffe fighters often flew missions with reduced ammunition loads because full loads were not available. The cumulative effect was that German fighters were both outgunned by individual American bombers and unable to sustain the volume of fire necessary to quickly destroy bombers before defensive fire became effective. The sound of overwhelming force, the 50 calibers. Sound became psychologically significant for both sides. For American bomber crews, the sound of their own guns firing was reassurance. It meant they were fighting back, that they were not passive targets, that the enemy was entering their defensive sphere and taking damage. Gunners who survived missions often described the sound as empowering. the one aspect of combat they could control through their own actions. Sergeant John O'Neill, a ball turret gunner on a B-17, described the experience in a letter home. When the fighters come in, everything else disappears. There's just you and the gun and the target. You press the triggers and the gun roars and the whole turret shakes. You can see your tracers reaching out, and if you're lucky, you see them hitting. The sound is so loud, it goes through your headset and your skull and into your chest. But it's a good sound because it means you're hitting back. The worst moments are when the gun jams and there's silence. You're working frantically to clear the stoppage while fighters are shooting at you and there's nothing you can do. Then you get the gun working again and the sound comes back and it's like you can breathe again. For Luftwaffe pilots, the sound was different. They heard it through the noise of their own engines and the chaos of combat. But they heard it, the distinctive staccato roar of multiple 50 caliber guns firing simultaneously, a sound that intensified as they closed with bomber formations. Pilots learned to associate the sound with the impacts of rounds striking their aircraft, with the death of wingmen, with missions where more pilots were lost than returned. Hauptmann Günther Specht, a Luftwaffe fighter commander, wrote in his combat diary, "You hear them before you see the damage." The sound of heavy machine guns firing is different from our weapons, deeper, more rapid. When you are in range, you hear it even over your engine. Then you hear the impacts, metal tearing, something in your aircraft breaking. You know you must press the attack or break off, and the sound is telling you that every second you stay in their fire is reducing your chances of survival. The sound became symbolic of American firepower more broadly, just as the sound of American artillery had come to represent overwhelming material superiority in World War I. The sound of massed 50 caliber fire represented the American approach to air warfare, using volume of fire and industrial capacity to create conditions where individual skill and courage were insufficient to overcome material disadvantage. Japanese pilots in the Pacific experienced the same phenomenon. The Mitsubishi A6M0 had been designed for maneuverability and range, with minimal armor and self-sealing fuel tanks to save weight. The Zero was an excellent fighter against opponents with similar armament. Against aircraft armed with 50 caliber guns, the Zero's light construction became a critical vulnerability. American fighter pilots quickly learned that the 50 caliber could destroy Zeros with short bursts. The API rounds would penetrate the Zero's thin skin, ignite fuel tanks, and cause structural failures. Zero pilots who survived combat with American fighters described aircraft that seemed impossibly durable and guns that seemed impossibly destructive. The psychological impact was significant. Pilots who knew their aircraft could be destroyed by a half-second burst of fire approached combat differently than pilots who flew aircraft that could absorb damage. The transformation of tactics, the .50 calibers, effectiveness forced tactical evolution on both sides. For the Germans, the weapon's lethality made traditional fighter tactics increasingly costly. Single-pass attacks by lone fighters or small formations resulted in prohibitive loss rates. Luftwaffe fighter commanders developed new approaches designed to minimize exposure to defensive fire. One approach was the use of heavy fighters like the Bf-110 and Me-410, which carried heavier armament, including 30mm cannons, and could attack from longer ranges. But heavy fighters were less maneuverable and themselves vulnerable to escort fighters, which by 1944 were increasingly able to accompany bombers throughout their missions. Another approach was the use of air-to-air rockets, unguided projectiles fired from outside the effective range of defensive guns. The rockets were inaccurate and required skilled pilots to employ effectively, but they allowed attacks without entering the cone of defensive fire. The Germans produced several thousand rocket-equipped fighters, but the weapon's effectiveness was limited and never solved the fundamental problem that attacking well-defended bomber formations required accepting heavy losses. The most significant German tactical adjustment was increasing emphasis on attacking bombers that had already been damaged and had left formation. These stragglers had reduced defensive firepower and could be attacked with less risk. Luftwaffe fighters would shadow bomber streams, waiting for damaged aircraft to fall behind, then attacking when the bomber was isolated and vulnerable. This tactic was effective, but did not prevent the majority of bombers from reaching their targets and returning safely. For the Americans, the .50 caliber's success validated the doctrine of self-defending bomber formations. In theory, massed bombers with interlocking fields of fire could protect themselves without fighter escort. This theory was tested during 1943 in raids deep into Germany, including the disastrous raid on Schweinfurt in October 1943, where 60 of 291 bombers were lost, a loss rate over 20% that was unsustainable. The lesson learned was that defensive armament, however effective, was not sufficient without fighter escort. The .50 caliber could inflict heavy losses on attacking fighters, but determined attacks by sufficient numbers of fighters could overwhelm defenses through sheer volume. The solution was long-range escort fighters, particularly the P-51 Mustang, armed with 6 .50 caliber guns that could engage Luftwaffe fighters before they reached the bombers. The combination of heavily armed bombers and escort fighters armed with the same .50 caliber guns created a layered defense that proved decisive. German fighters attacking bomber formations faced fire from both the bombers and the escorts. Ammunition expenditure data from 1944 shows that combined bomber defensive, fire and escort offensive fire resulted in Luftwaffe loss rates that approached 25–30% on major raids, losses that could not be sustained. The evidence of superiority post-war analysis, including captured German documents and interviews with Luftwaffe personnel, confirmed what combat statistics had suggested. The .50 caliber machine gun was significantly more effective than German intelligence had anticipated, and more lethal than German pilots had been prepared to face. A German technical intelligence report from 1943, captured after the war, analyzed American bomber defensive armament. The report noted, the American .50 caliber machine gun represents a significant advance over previous defensive armament. The weapon combines high rate of fire with projectiles that are individually capable of destroying fighter aircraft. The Americans have solved the ammunition feed problems that limited earlier heavy machine guns, and have created installations that allow rapid engagement of targets across wide arcs. Most significantly, American bombers carry sufficient ammunition that defensive fire can be sustained throughout extended engagements. Our pilots report that attacking American bomber formations results in loss rates significantly higher than attacks on British bombers with similar defensive armament but smaller caliber. Weapons. The comparison with British bombers was revealing. British heavy bombers like the Lancaster carried 303 caliber machine guns, rifle caliber weapons, roughly equivalent to the German 7.92mm guns. British bombers carried more guns than German fighters, typically 8 to 10, but the smaller caliber meant that many hits were required to destroy a fighter. German pilots preferred attacking British bombers over American bombers, specifically because the defensive fire was less lethal. Kill claims, always suspect in wartime but useful for relative comparisons, showed consistent patterns. German fighters attacking American heavy bombers claimed approximately 2 to 3 bombers destroyed per mission, on average during 1943–44. American bomber gunners claimed approximately 3 to 5 German fighters destroyed per mission. Post-war analysis suggested actual figures were lower on both sides due to overclaiming, but the relative ratio held. Bomber gunners were destroying or damaging German fighters at rates that exceeded the rate at which fighters were destroying bombers. More telling were Luftwaffe personnel loss records. Fighter pilot casualties during 1943–44 reached levels that threatened to destroy the fighter force as an effective organization. In some months, over 30% of fighter pilots were killed, wounded, or captured. Training could not keep pace with losses. Replacement pilots arrived at frontline units with minimal experience and were often lost on their first missions. The attrition was not sustainable. Field Marshal Erhard Milch, who oversaw German aircraft production, wrote in a memorandum to Göring in early 1944, "Our fighter losses are unsustainable. We are losing pilots faster than training can replace them. The primary cause is the effectiveness of American bomber defensive armament. Our pilots must press attacks to close range to ensure hits with our weapons. At close range, American defensive fire is devastating. We require weapons that allow attack from beyond the effective range of defensive guns, or we require fighters with sufficient armor to survive close-range combat. Neither solution is currently available in quantities sufficient to affect the strategic situation." Milch's assessment was accurate and pessimistic. The Germans did develop heavier fighters and standoff weapons, but never in quantities that changed the fundamental equation. American bomber streams continued to strike German targets. German fighters continued to attack them and suffer heavy losses. The .50 caliber continued to destroy fighters at rates that the Luftwaffe could not afford. The Pacific dimensioned the .50 calibers. Dominance was, if anything, more pronounced in the Pacific theater, where Japanese aircraft were generally lighter and less armored than German fighters. The Zero's light construction, which gave it excellent maneuverability and range, made it extremely vulnerable to heavy machine gun fire. American fighter pilots in the Pacific quickly developed tactics that exploited the .50 caliber's advantages. Rather than trying to outmaneuver the Zero, which was generally superior in turning performance, American pilots used diving attacks that maximized closure speed and firing time. A Grumman F-6F Hellcat or Vought F-4U Corsair, both armed with 6 .50 caliber guns, could dive on a Zero, fire a 2-second burst, and destroy or cripple the Japanese fighter before it could respond. The standard ammunition load for a Hellcat was 400 rounds per gun, 2,400 rounds total. At 800 rounds per minute per gun, this represented about 30 seconds of sustained fire or 15 2-second bursts. In practice, most successful attacks required only 1 or 2 bursts. American fighter pilots were trained to close to within 300 yards before firing, range, where the .50 caliber was most effective and where target tracking was easiest. Japanese pilot accounts consistently describe surprise at how quickly American fighters could destroy Japanese aircraft. Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's highest-scoring aces who survived the war, wrote, "American fighters were heavily armed, and their pilots fought differently than we had been trained to expect. They would not dogfight. They would dive from above, fire a short burst and zoom away before we could react. If their burst hit, the result was usually fatal. The American bullets were very destructive. A short burst could tear apart an aircraft that would have survived. Many hits from rifle-caliber weapons, the .50 calibers, effectiveness in the Pacific, contributed to kill ratios that heavily favored American pilots. By 1944, American carrier pilots were achieving kill ratios exceeding 10.1 over Japanese opponents. Some of this advantage derived from superior pilot training and better tactics, but the weapon's lethality was a significant factor. Japanese pilots flying unarmored, aircraft against opponents armed with 650 caliber. Machine guns were at a severe disadvantage, in that skill alone could not overcome. Japanese aircraft designers recognized the problem and attempted to address it in later aircraft designs. The Kawanishi N1K-J Shiden, George, and Mitsubishi J2M Raiden, Jack, incorporated armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks, making them more resistant to .50 caliber fire. But these aircraft arrived late in the war and in limited numbers. The majority of Japanese fighters throughout the war remained vulnerable to the .50 caliber in ways that made close combat extremely dangerous for Japanese pilots. The symbol of firepower, the Browning .50 caliber. machine gun transcended its function as a weapon and became symbolic of American military-industrial capacity. The gun itself represented engineering excellence, a weapon that was reliable, powerful, and adaptable to multiple roles. The ammunition represented industrial capacity, billions of rounds produced through the coordination of multiple factories and supply chains. The sound represented dominance, the acoustic signature of overwhelming firepower applied to the problem of air superiority. For American servicemen, the .50 caliber was ubiquitous. It armed bombers, fighters, tanks, vehicles, ships, and fixed installations. A soldier in Europe, a sailor in the Pacific, a marine in the island campaigns, and an airman over Germany all would have encountered the weapon. Its presence was reassuring, evidence that American industry could produce excellent weapons in quantities that ensured every unit had sufficient firepower. For Axis soldiers, the .50 caliber represented the material inequality that defined their experience fighting America. German and Japanese forces often had superior training, superior tactical doctrine, and in some cases, superior individual weapons. But they never had material superiority. The .50 caliber was one of many weapons that demonstrated American capacity to produce good enough weapons in quantities that rendered superior but scarce Axis weapons insufficient. The gun's longevity is itself testimony to its effectiveness. The basic M2 design from 1933 remains in service today, nearly a century later, with minimal modifications. Modern versions are more reliable and have improved manufacturing, but the fundamental mechanism is unchanged. The weapon has armed American forces through World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the Cold War, and continuing conflicts. It has been licensed and copied by dozens of nations. It is arguably the most successful heavy machine gun design in history. This longevity validates the original design philosophy. Browning created a weapon that was powerful, enough to remain relevant across dramatic changes in military technology. The .50 caliber that destroyed Bf-109s in 1943 is mechanically identical to the .50 caliber mounted on modern vehicles and helicopters. The ammunition is interchangeable. The operating principles are unchanged. Very few weapons maintained frontline relevance for nearly a century. The epilogue of Thunderstand, on the flight deck of a preserved B-17 today, the ones maintained by museums and collectors, painted in the colors of specific aircraft that flew specific missions, and you can still see the .50 caliber gun positions. The waist positions where gunners stood in open windows, firing at attacking fighters. The ball turret underneath, where gunners operated in cramped isolation. The tail position, where gunners defended against attacks from astern. The dorsal turret. The chin turret beneath the nose. Run your hand along the gun mount, and you can feel where the metal was worn smooth by the movement of the weapon, traversing and elevating thousands of times. Look at the ammunition feed system, and you can see the elegance of the design, the chutes that guided belted ammunition from storage cans to the gun, the mechanisms that ensured smooth feeding even when the aircraft was maneuvering violently. Everything about the installation was engineered for reliability under conditions where failure meant death. The guns themselves are inert now, disabled per regulations governing display of functional weapons, but they look ready. The barrels still point outward. The sights are still aligned. The ammunition cans are still in position. It takes very little imagination to hear the sound, that hammering roar multiplied by 10 guns on a single bomber, multiplied again by hundreds of bombers in formation, creating a sound that dominated the sky over Germany and Japan from 1943 until the war ended. That sound was the acoustic embodiment of American industrial warfare. It was metal and chemistry and precision manufacturing translated into 850 rounds per minute per gun. It was Detroit and Cleveland and New Haven factories running 3 shifts producing weapons and ammunition. It was engineering decisions made in the 1930s, proving correct under combat conditions in the 1940s. It was the accumulated advantage of an industrial system that could design excellent weapons and then produce them by the tens of thousands. The 50 caliber machine gun did not win World War II by itself. No single weapon wins wars. Wars are won by combinations of strategy, tactics, logistics, training, leadership, and the accumulated effects of thousands of individual engagements. But the 50 caliber contributed decisively to air superiority over Europe and the Pacific. It made American bombers survivable enough that strategic bombing campaigns could continue despite heavy losses. It made American fighters lethal enough that Axis pilots faced opponents who could destroy them with brief bursts of fire. It represented a philosophy of warfare that emphasized volume of effective fire over individual marksmanship, industrial production over craft production, and systematic advantage over tactical brilliance. The Germans and Japanese never developed an adequate answer to the 50 caliber because answering it required matching American industrial capacity, and that was impossible. They could produce excellent weapons, the German MG 151-20 cannon, the Japanese Type 99 cannon, but they could not produce them in the quantities necessary to overcome the cumulative advantage of American production. They could train excellent pilots, but they could not replace losses fast enough when those pilots had to fight through defensive fire that destroyed one fighter for every 3 or 4 bomber attack passes. The disparity was fundamental. The 50 caliber worked not just because it was a good weapon, though it was, but because American industry could produce it and its ammunition in quantities that made saturation firepower doctrinally viable. German and Japanese forces fought with scarcity as a constant constraint. Ammunition was rationed. Replacement weapons were scarce. Pilots were taught to conserve ammunition because there might not be more available. American forces fought with abundance as a baseline assumption. Gunners were trained to fire sustained bursts because ammunition was plentiful. If a gun was damaged, it was replaced. If ammunition ran low, more was supplied. The psychological effect of this abundance was significant. American forces could fight without the constant anxiety about resource constraints that hampered Axis forces. The sound of the 50 caliber was the sound of abundance weaponized. It was the thunder of a free society's industrial capacity applied to the problem of defeating tyrannies that had chosen war. It was 850 rounds per minute, saying that freedom, properly organized and mobilized, could produce weapons in volumes that courage and determination alone could not overcome. Listen to recordings of that sound. There are audio clips preserved from the war, captured by combat camera crews or radio operators who recorded the audio of air battles. The sound is distinctive, even at low quality, through 80-year-old recording equipment. It is rapid, percussive, relentless. It goes on, burst after burst, the sound of a weapons system that has sufficient ammunition that sustained fire is tactically viable. That sound echoed across the skies of Europe and Asia for 4 years. It meant different things to different listeners. For American bomber crews, it meant survival. For Luftwaffe pilots, it meant danger and loss. For people on the ground, civilians in Berlin or Tokyo or Manila, it meant that American air power was overhead and that the war was reaching them despite everything their governments had done to prevent it. The 50 caliber machine gun was not the only weapon that brought American victory, but it was emblematic of why victory came. It was engineered well enough to work reliably. It was produced abundantly enough to equip every platform that needed it. It was supplied copiously enough that ammunition was never a limiting factor. It was effective enough that enemies could not ignore it and could not overcome it. Stand in a museum next to a preserved bomber. Look at the gun positions. Imagine the cold at 25,000 feet, the fear during fighter attacks, the chaos of combat where everything happened in seconds and the only control you had was your thumbs on the trigger. Imagine the sound And imagine what that sound meant to the men creating it and the men dying because of it. The thunder of the .50 caliber was the voice of industrial democracy at war. It spoke in a language of steel and fire and overwhelming volume. It said that free societies could outproduce unfree societies. That distributed industrial power exceeded centralized control. That abundance properly weaponized defeated scarcity, regardless of how skillfully that scarcity was employed. The Axis had no answer to the .50 caliber because the answer would have required matching American industrial capacity, and that was never possible. The weapon was not invincible. Many bombers were shot down, many gunners killed, many fighters survived attacks. But the cumulative effect across thousands of missions and hundreds of thousands of bursts of fire was air superiority purchased through industrial capacity. The gun fired at 850 rounds per minute. Multiply that by 10 guns per bomber, by hundreds of bombers per mission, by thousands of missions per year. The arithmetic produced air superiority through volume of fire sustained across time and space. The thunder never stopped until the war ended, and when the war ended, the .50 caliber remained. It remains still. The thunder continues quieter now in training exercises and ceremonial flights. But the sound is unchanged. The weapon is unchanged. The truth it represented, that industrial capacity is itself a weapon, perhaps the decisive weapon of modern warfare, remains valid. 850 rounds per minute. That was the answer. The Axis found no counter.